I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby here with Carl Herse, the Emmy-nominated cinematographer of the entire final season of HBO's Barry. And Carl, the last time that you and I spoke, you had done like 3 or 4 episodes of season 3, and this time Bill Hader's directing all the episodes, and you're the DP for the entire thing. How does that change influence? How does that change your process? How does that change your work, working with the same director and knowing that you're kind of going along with the ride for the entire season?
Yeah, I feel like, over the entire course of the series, I think Bill has tried to treat it as one big story and not in the way that most TV is created, where you kind of deal with things episodically. But when you have different directors coming through, when you're alternating DPs, there is a certain amount of telephone that has to happen when you're communicating what the intention of the storyline is, what the arc's going to be, and kind of what the visual side of things is going to be. And so with Bill and I taking on the whole final season, I'm not sure if it's a discernible change from what the previous seasons looked like, but for us, it was a very clean way of working because we had total control. He and I get along very well. We have very similar sensibility creatively. And so we were able to kind of attack the whole season as this one long story. It was more like shooting a movie than a TV series.
I'm curious, working that closely with him. I'm curious because I've heard how, kind of deeply rooted he is in classic cinema and things like that. I'm wondering if you two develop like a shorthand, like when you're talking about a shot, are you two constantly like referencing other films?
Yes, all the time. I mean, that's something that as a shorthand, he and I developed a shorthand very quickly, but oftentimes when we're talking about a shot, we'll just say, the Raiders of the Lost Ark shot or the shot from The Shining or whatever. And right away we know what the other person's talking about. And that definitely happened several times. There's a sequence in early in the season where Barry is hallucinating and he's watching this wedding party approach in the distance that transitions us into a hallway. And then the way that you see this big wedding party take place, Bill was trying to describe what that was, and no one in the room was really understanding it. And then I had a moment of like, oh, it's the shot from The Shining when he walks into the ballroom. And he's like, yeah, that's exactly it. And it's like, oh, okay. And then everyone gets it because everyone's seen the movie and you know what it is.
So I want to, being that you had all of the episodes of this season, you have the unenviable task of choosing what episode you submit for the Emmys, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm curious from your perspective, just why Tricky Legacies?
I don't know. I feel like I always respond to the episodes in a show that kind of deviate and take the viewer and the audience into like this kind of weird other format. And for me, that episode was just its own entity in a weird way. There's a time jump. You're playing catch up the whole time as the audience. And the story is just focused on this very linear narrative with a small group of people rather than jumping between an A story, a B story, a C story, that kind of thing. There's a little bit of that with Sally and Bevel, but I loved the story first and foremost. And so I think that's the starting place. There was definitely a lot of deliberation between, do you choose the finale episode, which is obviously going to be a big one with a lot of action and interesting sequences and something the audience is going to focus on because it's the series finale. But Bill and I talked about it, and I just think that episode, Tricky Legacies, is the best example of the cinematography doing a lot of the storytelling work. And so I'm hoping that is something people respond to when it comes to looking at the options, and that's something that I'm very proud of our work on that, on that episode.
Well, and I feel like that episode in particular has such a unique challenge because, as you mentioned, this is the 8-year time jump, and we're in a different environment with characters who are different enough from who they have been that visually you have to tell a different story here. And so what were some of the challenges with that particular challenge?
I mean, the main thing is how do you communicate a time jump without doing something that I would find to be kind of cheesy, like having a suddenly dramatic different look or different lenses or different format of some kind. You still want the show to feel like Barry. You also want to create a unique experience for that episode. And you want the whole thing to, you're still trying to tell the story, which is that Barry and Sally are in hiding. There's this kind of eerie supernatural threat hovering over them of like, will they be found out? And because we had the anchor point of that house in the middle of nowhere, that became like the big storytelling device that I thought was really compelling. There was a lot that could be done with lighting for day scenes, to have this kind of oppressive daylight coming in through all the windows, like the outside world is putting pressure on them, and they're in this tiny little this little hiding place. And then for the night scenes, when we're in and around the house, it's kind of this lit up beacon of light that's surrounded by blackness, which kind of gives you the inverse impression, which is that, when Barry steps outside into the darkness, he's literally staring into the face of pure blackness and fear and paranoia. And I just, that to me, that I don't know, I loved it. I loved the episode. I loved it on the page. I loved the way that we talked about it. We talked about, films that we both love. We love Paris, Texas, that kind of thing, which that's every cinematographer's favorite reference. But there's moments that I feel like we really kind of got that sensibility, onto the screen.
Yeah, you mentioned the concept of characters kind of stepping into blackness, which has been kind of a repeating
Yeah.
Motif in the series, and we see it multiple times. We see, Sarah Goldberg, her monologue going into the black, and the last thing we see of Fuchs is him going off into the blackness. What is it about that kind of visual that you think, works so well?
Well, I think, from a shot design standpoint, storytelling standpoint, what we've always tried to do is create something expressive that isn't overly stylistic. We don't want the viewer to really think about what the conventions are. We don't want to be too, I don't know, nail on the head, but it's an easy convention that speaks volumes, and it's a consistent, convention that's been used throughout the series. So when you return to it, I think is very effective.
I want to just very briefly talk about some of the other kind of, for me, some of the just amazing set pieces of this season, particularly the Dave and Buster's crime lord meeting, which I have read was kind of a headache in terms of getting the lighting right.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a 360-degree shot where we had to, execute everything all in one setup. So there's always going to be an inherent challenge there. But again, because we do so much in prep, it took a lot of takes just because everybody has to sync up performance wise. And there was a lot of lighting done at the beginning of the day to set up the shot, but everyone knew what it was going into it. We had a table that was specially built by the art department with a hole cut out in the middle of it, so we could have a camera on a remote head that was centered on the table. And then once you're lit, you can just let the actors do whatever they want to do. And it gave us the freedom, having lit the space for 360 degrees, to improvise a little bit, because I don't know what you've seen or heard about that shot, but there was never meant to be the moment late in the shot where NoHo Hank kind of goes running through the frame to get back on the mark he's supposed to be on. That was all kind of improvised on the day. And had we not been lit for 360, that wouldn't have been so easy to just fold into the blocking.
And yet it seems so perfect. It seems so Hank.
Oh, I was dying. I didn't know he was going to do it. That was a moment where Bill kind of gave him the note and I didn't hear it. And then when I saw it, I like fell out of the tent laughing because it was so ridiculous.
The entire sequence in the last episode, the standoff between, Hank and Fuchs. I mean, I spoke to Wade Allen, the brilliant stunt coordinator, about that whole sequence. But to me, what makes that sequence work is the tight close-ups cutting between Hank and Fuchs. And both Stephen and Anthony have talked in depth about that. What was it like, having to tell actors, don't move?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that Bill is very good at as an actor. He can explain to the actors why he's positioning them or blocking them in a certain way and how the camera is going to help their performance. He also, something we've talked about in the past is most shows you over cover things. You shoot a medium, a close-up, a wide shot, a two shot, a 50-50, which is like a profile angle, because you don't know how you're going to put it together. And with Bill and I, there's just it's really about how do we shoot something with minimal coverage so the actor can give the best possible performance without getting worn out or without having to reserve their performance so that they can last through an 8 or 9 hour session of coverage pieces. We did that whole sequence in 2 setups, and up until the shootout portion, it was just those close-ups. And then with Anthony and Steven, they're just such powerhouses that you're going to get everything you need out of those shots. And another thing we talk about a lot is that moments have to be earned, and we really don't shoot close-ups very often on the show. That's something that a lot of people in the crew always comment on, is that we're always a little bit wider than one might think in terms of the camera to subject distance relationship. But when the camera is close and it is intimate and subjective in the way those two shots are, it's an earned moment, and it has that much more impact for the audience. I love that sequence. And then leading into the action part of the sequence, it's similarly an earned moment, because although it's a oneer, and that's something we've done multiple times over the course of the show, it's telling you this story. It's the story is that these two warring gangs think they're so tough, and in reality they're humans and they're mortal, and Fuchs makes a choice to save John in that final moment, and we find him. And so all that story is there as part of this kind of deceptively simple shot that was really quite complicated to execute.
Well, and you touch on something that I think is really interesting, in that you mentioned trying to avoid, doing these big kind of like super theatrical or super cheesy or show off sort of things. So how do you ever like have this little voice in your head where you get an idea and then you go, maybe that's too much?
Yes, for sure. I think that's something that Bill and I we'll talk about stuff, and in the way that he writes the scripts, it's even kind of that way. A lot of times there's way more dialogue in the first draft of the script, and then you're just editing yourself and cutting it back to like, what is the core of this? And I think that's why the story of Barry has such a fast moving plot, because it's just these very edited down moments that are pretty simply executed, that allow you to fit a lot of story into a 30-minute episode.
So, coming off of an experience like this, does it kind of set the bar at a different level for future projects?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's, everyone says it. Everyone's sad that the show's over. It was, truly the greatest project of my career. I feel like, I've spent many years kind of seeking out filmmakers that have a similar voice as mine and similar sensibility as mine. And this is as close as I've ever gotten to working on something that I really believe is the strongest example of the filmmaking medium. You know what I mean? And it's gonna be hard to it's already hard going into other projects, but I've also learned a lot, and I've taken some of that into future projects. And ultimately Bill's a young filmmaker at the beginning of his career, and I think he has a lot of compelling stories to tell, and hopefully he'll ask some of us back to help him out with those.
Oh, pretty please. Oh, pretty please. Carl, congratulations. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Emmys, and stay tuned for interviews with more Emmy nominees in the coming weeks. Carl Herse, always great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.